Medical records of a saint. To declare someone a saint in the 21st century, the Catholic Church does not rely solely on stories of personal holiness. It requires rigorous medical documentation, scientific testimony, and evidence that defies natural explanation. In May of the year 2024, the Vatican approved the final miracle needed to canonize a millennial teenager named Carlo Acutis. Born in the year 1991 and passing away at the age of 15, Carlo was a computer programmer, a typical student who wore sneakers and played video games. Yet he is now the first millennial saint in the long history of Christianity. But the process of canonization is not a simple declaration. The modern procedure demands exhaustive investigation, separating pious devotion from verifiable scientific fact. For someone who was not martyred, the Church requires two distinct miracles, one for beatification and a second for full canonization. These miracles almost always involve medical healings that a board of independent physicians must classify as instantaneous, complete, lasting, and scientifically unexplainable. So what exactly happened in the medical records of two young people facing certain death? And how did the Vatican investigate these cases to reach its unprecedented conclusion? The story of the first miracle begins far from Italy, in the city of Campo Grande, Brazil. A young boy named Matthias Viana was born with a severe congenital condition known as an annular pancreas. In a normal human body, the pancreas sits behind the stomach. But in Matthias, a rare developmental anomaly caused a ring of pancreatic tissue to wrap completely around the first part of the small intestine. This anatomical defect essentially strangled his digestive tract. Whenever the boy attempted to eat solid food, the constriction prevented the food from passing through, resulting in constant vomiting and severe malnutrition. By the time he was 3 years old, Matthias weighed less than 20 pounds. He survived on a highly restricted liquid diet, and his physical development was drastically stunted. Medical professionals warned his mother, Luciana, that his condition was critical. The only known treatment for an annular pancreas is complex surgery to bypass the obstruction. But because the boy was so severely underweight and weakened, doctors hesitated to operate, fearing his fragile body would not survive the procedure. His condition was thoroughly documented, undeniable, and physically visible in every medical scan. The turning point occurred on October 12, 2013. A local priest was holding a special blessing at his parish, using a certified relic of Carlo Acutis. The relic was a small piece of clothing that had belonged to the Italian teenager. Luciana brought her son to the church, desperate for a spiritual intervention when medical science offered only risky and terrifying alternatives. According to the testimonies later submitted to the Vatican, Luciana had instructed her son to pray for healing. As they approached the relic, the severely weakened 3-year-old boy touched the cloth and simply asked to stop vomiting. What happened next forms the absolute foundation of the first official investigation. On the journey home, Matthias asked for solid food. When his mother gave him a meal, he ate normally. He did not vomit. Over the following days, he continued to eat a completely normal diet without any of the violent physical reactions that had defined his entire short life. But a sudden ability to eat is not enough to satisfy a Vatican investigation. Subjective improvements happen in medicine. Children sometimes adapt to conditions. To prove a miracle, the investigators needed objective, structural evidence that a permanent anatomical change had occurred. When doctors performed new ultrasound and clinical imaging tests on Matthias, the results presented a physiological impossibility. The physical structure of his internal organs had fundamentally changed. The anatomical ring that had strangled his digestive tract was no longer obstructing his intestines. The severe congenital defect had completely resolved itself without a scalpel ever touching his body. For the doctors who reviewed the scans, there was no medical precedent for an annular pancreas spontaneously correcting its own shape overnight. The physical evidence was submitted to the Medical Commission of the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints in Rome. The Vatican Medical Board consists of independent specialists, some of whom are not Catholic. Their sole job is to review the empirical data. They do not declare an event a miracle. They only determine whether the healing has any possible explanation within current medical literature. They examined the before and after scans of the Brazilian boy. They looked for signs of misdiagnosis, spontaneous remission, or delayed surgical intervention. They found none. The records showed a child with a lethal anatomical defect on one day, and a child with a normal functioning digestive system the next, with the medical board confirming the sudden and unexplainable physical change. Theologians then verified that the healing occurred in direct connection to the prayer directed at Carlo Acutis. On October 10th, 2020, Carlo was officially declared blessed. But while the case in Brazil satisfied the requirements for beatification, the final step of canonization would require a second, completely distinct event. A second medical impossibility that would emerge nearly a decade later, under even more dramatic circumstances, in the intensive care unit of a hospital in Florence. Continuo para a próxima parte dois. The intensive care unit at the Careggi Hospital in Florence is a place defined by cold medical realities and precise neurological protocols. It was here, in early July of the year 2022, that the second investigation into Carlo Acutis began. The patient was Valeria Valverde, a 21-year-old university student from Costa Rica who had moved to Italy to pursue her studies. On the 2nd of July, she was riding her bicycle in the city center when she suffered a catastrophic fall. The impact was devastating. When emergency responders arrived, they found a young woman with massive trauma to her head. At the hospital, the initial scans revealed a fractured occipital bone and a severe subarachnoid hemorrhage. In simpler terms, her brain was bleeding profusely, and the resulting pressure inside her skull was rapidly increasing to fatal levels. Doctors rushed her into an emergency craniotomy, removing a section of her skull to relieve the mounting pressure on her delicate brain tissue. The prognosis delivered to her family was bleak. According to the medical records later submitted to the Vatican, the surgeons informed Valeria's relatives that her condition was extremely critical. The chances of survival were exceptionally low. Even if she somehow managed to live through the acute phase of the trauma, the extensive damage to her brain meant she would likely face severe, permanent neurological impairment. She was placed on a mechanical ventilator, suspended in a precarious state between life and death. For 6 days, Valeria remained in the intensive care unit, showing no signs of meaningful recovery. The medical team maintained her life support, but the physiological damage appeared irreversible. It was at this moment of absolute medical exhaustion that her mother, Liliana, decided to seek a different kind of intervention. Leaving the hospital in Florence, Liliana traveled to the medieval city of Assisi. Assisi has been known for centuries as the home of Saint Francis. But in recent years, a new focal point of devotion has emerged within the ancient city walls. The sanctuary of the Renunciation now houses the tomb of Carlo Acutis. On July 8, 2022, exactly 6 days after the catastrophic accident, Liliana arrived at the sanctuary. She knelt before the tomb of the millennial teenager, praying for the life of her daughter, and left a written letter detailing her plea. What happened next was meticulously documented by the nursing staff and doctors back in Florence. On that exact same day, July 8th, Valeria began to breathe independently. The sudden shift was entirely unexpected. She opened her eyes. She began to move her upper limbs. Within hours, a patient who had been entirely dependent on a machine and suffering from fatal brain trauma was regaining basic motor functions and showing signs of returning consciousness. But as with the previous case in Brazil, a subjective clinical improvement was not enough to satisfy the strict requirements for a canonization miracle. The Vatican demands clinical proof of an inexplicable structural healing. When neurologists performed a new computed tomography scan on Valeria, they found something that defied their clinical experience. The extensive hemorrhage that had threatened to destroy her brain had simply vanished. The severe swelling had subsided in a manner and at a speed that did not align with any known natural process of recovery from such a massive injury. The timeline of her physical rehabilitation was just as baffling. By July 18th, only 10 days after the prayer in Assisi, she was completely discharged from the intensive care unit. Her recovery was so rapid that on September 2nd, just 2 months after the accident that was supposed to end her life, Valeria walked into the sanctuary in Assisi alongside her mother to offer thanks. The missing piece of her skull was eventually replaced, but her neurological function was fully restored. When this massive medical dossier reached the dicastery for the causes of saints in Rome, it faced an intense level of scientific scrutiny. The Vatican Medical Board does not easily accept extraordinary claims, especially involving neurology, where the brain can sometimes yield surprising results. The independent commission of specialists examined the precise timeline, the initial emergency scans, the operative reports from the craniotomy, and the subsequent imaging that showed the vanished hemorrhage. They debated whether the emergency surgery itself could account for the rapid recovery, or if the medication administered could explain the sudden reversal. After exhaustive analysis, they reached a unanimous conclusion. The healing was instantaneous, complete, lasting, and entirely unexplainable according to the established parameters of medical science. This second verified event provided the definitive evidence required by canon law. It completed the necessary documentation to elevate Carlo Acutis to the highest recognition of the Catholic Church. But while these rigorous medical investigations answered the strict empirical questions of what exactly happened in the hospitals, they also invite a deeper reflection on what this means for a generation driven by technology and skepticism. Continuo para proxima parte tres. The approval of the second miracle in 2024 marked a historical turning point for the Catholic Church. For centuries, the process of canonization was often associated with distant historical figures, ancient martyrs, or cloistered mystics whose lives were recorded in medieval manuscripts. But the case of Carlo Acutis forces a re-examination of how the modern world understands the intersection of faith, medicine, and verifiable evidence. The Vatican did not base its decision on folklore or undocumented legends. It based its highest theological declaration on contemporary medical records, ultrasound scans, computed tomography imaging, and the testimonies of 21st century surgeons and neurologists. When we analyze the two healings that elevated Carlo to sainthood, a distinct pattern emerges. In both cases, the patients faced catastrophic, life-threatening conditions with no immediate or safe medical solution. Matthias Viana was starving to death because of a congenital structural defect that physically strangled his digestive system. Valeria Valverde was suffering from an acute traumatic brain injury with immense internal pressure that typical emergency procedures could not reverse. In both instances, the medical interventions had reached their absolute limits, and the prognosis offered by secular medical professionals was uniformly grim. The turning point for both patients was not a new experimental drug or a delayed surgical success. The turning point was a specific documented moment of prayer directed toward a teenager who died in the year 2006. But what makes these investigations entirely unique is the speed and structural nature of the recoveries. The Vatican Medical Commission does not classify gradual rehabilitation as a miracle. For a healing to be recognized, it must defy the known biological timeline. An annular pancreas does not spontaneously reshape itself into normal anatomy overnight. A massive subarachnoid hemorrhage does not simply vanish and leave a patient with full neurological function within days. The scientific board essentially declared that according to all current medical knowledge, these two patients should not have recovered the way they did. This rigorous empirical standard serves a specific purpose for the Church today. We live in an era characterized by scientific skepticism, where claims of the supernatural are routinely dismissed as psychological coping mechanisms or statistical anomalies. By demanding undeniable clinical proof, the Dicastery for the Causes of Saints attempts to separate true miraculous intervention from wishful thinking. They are not claiming that science is flawed. Rather, they are acknowledging that science has precise boundaries, and that in these two specific cases, those boundaries were clearly crossed by something inexplicable. But the canonization of Carlo Acutis carries an impact that goes far beyond medical dossiers. It presents a new archetype of holiness. Carlo was not a priest or a monk. He was a teenager who wore jeans, played video games on his console, built websites, and worried about his friends. He lived in the digital age, surrounded by the same distractions and technologies that define modern youth. Yet, his deep devotion and his deliberate use of the internet to catalog religious phenomena created a legacy that resonated globally. The fact that the first millennial saint is a computer programmer whose miracles are validated by modern medical imaging is a powerful statement about the continuity of the sacred in a highly secularized world. Ultimately, the medical records of the Brazilian boy and the Costa Rican student do not force anyone to believe. Faith remains a choice. However, the physical evidence forces observers to confront a profound mystery. The documentation exists. The before and after scans are undeniable facts of modern medicine. The unexplainable nature of their survival is certified by independent medical professionals. The miracles that made Carlo Acutis a saint stand as highly documented events where the natural laws of biology seem to have been suspended, pointing to a reality that extends far beyond the hospital room. Interestingly, before his death, Carlo spent years using his computer skills to build an extensive digital catalog investigating other unexplained physical phenomena, specifically focusing on Eucharistic miracles around the world. Some of the cases he documented involve ancient relics that have recently been subjected to modern DNA testing and forensic analysis, yielding results that continue to baffle secular scientists. If you would like our next investigation to examine the specific scientific evidence behind the Eucharistic miracles catalogued by Carlo Acutis, leave the word miracle in the comments.